welcome. Thank you for joining this month's Lunch and Learn 100 Years of WNYC. My name is Monica Murray. I am the Public Programming Officer here at the New York City Department of Records and Information Services, also known as DORIS. DORIS houses the city's municipal archives and library and is focused on fostering civic life by preserving and providing access to the historical and contemporary records of the New York City government and its records. I'll begin by introducing our two speakers, and then the speakers will take over. So today we're going to hear from Michael Lorenzini, who is DORIS's operations manager. He has worked at the agency since 1997 as a photographer, archivist, and the deputy director and curator of photography at the Municipal Archives. And Andy Lancet is the founding director of the New York Public Radio Archives. He has worked in public broadcasting as a reporter, producer, engineer, and archivist for the past 43 years. And I'll turn it over to Andy to begin his presentation.
Well, sorry for the delay, folks, and thanks to the New York City Municipal Archives for inviting me to participate. In particular, Records Commissioner Pauline Toole and Commissioner Operations Manager Michael Lorenzini. This is indeed just the tip of the iceberg of WNYC, as condensing 100 years into 20 minutes is my magic act for the day. Apologies to all of you for some favorite milestones that may get left on the cutting room floor, but this radio show does have a time limit. Which also means I won't be playing any audio, but that you can browse and listen to thousands of hours of WNYC broadcasts from the New York City Municipal Archives and the WNYC collections by going to the bottom of the WNYC.org homepage and clicking on Archived Shows. And if we move to slide 2, in the beginning, good place to start. WNYC was the brainchild of Grover A. Whalen, the city's commissioner for bridges, plant, and structures, in other words, public works. Whalen, in the upper left photo on the mic, had the brilliant idea to get the city involved in this emerging new technology, radio, and he convinces the powers that be that it's the thing to do to keep the public informed about what their government is doing for them and as an adjunct to various city services and the schools. But before all is said and done, he struggles with the nation's biggest radio equipment operators and manufacturers and the government to get a transmitter in place on the radio for a place on the radio spectrum. And this takes him 2 years. Pictured on the lower right, you should see the engineering log from our inaugural broadcast of July 8th, 1924. And in the upper right-hand picture, you see Grover Whalen with Mayor Hyland there looking at the station's new transmitter. We can go on to the next slide. That should do it. There is, from 1924 to 34, we're looking at educational programming through the schools with Air College, tied to the City University of New York, and lots of talks from health and social service experts, a lot of what I call radio as lectern. Not terribly creative, but hey, radio is still very much in its infancy. I do want to note that there was an NAACP weekly slot, 1929 to 30, and another with the Urban League that make them among the earliest African-American radio shows in the country that aired on WNYC. There's also some misuse of the station by the Hyland administration that raised controversy early on and highlighted the chief problem of having a city-run station, that is, partisan editorial control. It's an issue that will dog WNYC for the next 73 years and cause them to effectively dodge bullets every time the city budget is considered. Added to this perennial debate of whether the taxpayer is getting their money's worth is the battle with WMCA over the original coveted WNYC frequency of 570 AM. We lose and end up at 810 AM with a mandate to sign off at sundown. Next slide, please. Moving forward, it's 1933, and Theodore H. LaGuardia is running for mayor. Part of his campaign platform is the elimination of WNYC, believe it or not, to save the taxpayer money. Of course, and he wins. And one of his first orders is to send a young Seymour N. Siegel over to shut the place down. That's Seymour Siegel in the lower left-hand corner of the slide. But Siegel convinces the mayor to hold off, and the station is placed on probation. A transition begins. Siegel begins taking on more and more of the duties of Christy Bonchak, the station's director for its first decade, and that's Bonchak in the upper left corner of the slide. Bonchak is an old newspaperman tied to Tammany Hall, I believe very well-meaning and doing an amazing amount of despite the lack of real programming budgets and funds available to him. But it's a lot of what I call radio as lectern. Siegel, however, brings in some innovation, like the broadcast of public hearings, which leads to landmark city council meetings and other innovations. But perhaps more than anything else, it's money and changes brought in by the Federal Works Progress Administration, or WPA, that turns LaGuardia from sour to sweet on WNYC. The WPA brings in a full schedule of music programming. The Federal Theater Radio Division brings drama and arts programming. The Federal Art Project sponsors the WNYC WPA murals, which were dedicated in 1939. And to top it off, the WPA underwrites the building of a new state-of-the-art transmitter site in Greenpoint, Brooklyn, and new studios at the Municipal Building. We also get our first lacquered disc cutter and start recording programs. And you can see here in the slide that there's a little bit of a blueprint there. That's from the original WPA blueprints for the Greenpoint transmitter site, as well as a lacquered disc label from the 1939 World's Fair, as well as the WPA disc that was recorded at WNYC in its original format and then distributed around the country by transcription disc. Next slide, please. At the beginning of LaGuardia's second term, he appoints Morris Novick, lower right of the slide, to run WNYC. And Novick comes to us from successful work at WEVD. LaGuardia is now, of course, very gung-ho about the station and wants it to become the flagship station of a non-commercial network of educational stations. Imagine that. Under Novick, we see the beginning of the annual American Music Festival with concerts around the city every February. A ticket there for one of the festivals on the top right of your screen. And there's the start of the Frick Collection concerts, pioneering Black programming with Clifford Burdett, pictured on the top left. There's a launch of jazz and folk programming, including the first of Leadbelly's 4 programs in the 1940s on the station. And of course, the bulk of Novick's tenure is taken up with WNYC's World War II coverage and programming. The station essentially becomes a clearinghouse of vital information of what Novick called educating for democracy, and what I characterize as doing for radio what Frank Capra did for film and with the Why We Fight series for the federal government. The station begins to set the standards for public radio as we know it today, be it for documentary production, public events, coverage, and arts and literature programming. And last, but certainly not least, WNYC FM begins regular broadcasts in March 1943. And in case you were wondering, the mayor's iconic reading of the comics takes place in July 1945 during the 17-day newspaper deliverymen's strike. Next slide, please. Post-war and the 1950s, Seymour Siegel returns from serving in the Navy and picks up where Novick left off with the festival genre. So along with the American Music Festival, there are annual book and art festivals added to the program schedule. It was also a time of great hope for the United Nations. And you see the former First Lady here, Eleanor Roosevelt, at a WNYC mic at an event concerning the UN Declaration of Human Rights. We're the leading broadcaster of UN conferences, sessions, and events. It's also the Cold War, and we're the first to go place to go, basically, for coverage of civil defense information and what the government says you should do in the event of an atomic attack. We also become public radio's first tape distribution hub, and innovation continues as we begin thematic music programming with David Randolph. And Tony Schwartz's earliest work with a portable tape recorder hits our air and wins the Prix Italia Prize for his Sounds of My City. That's Tony pictured there in the upper right with his hand cupped around his ear. The WNYC Film Unit also launches in 1949, and it's a precursor to what will be WNYC TV, the collections of which you will find at the New York City Municipal Archives. Next slide, please. And speaking of TV, in 1961 brings WUHF, the nation's first municipal television station, which would become WNYC TV Channel 31. Now, responding to the zeitgeist of the 1960s, there are a greater number of programs devoted to women's issues and African American issues and the civil rights movement. Lorraine Hansberry, pictured here, is interviewed by Patricia Marks Ellsberg, and Amiri Baraka talks to listeners from the Overseas Press Club, just one of many talks from that venue. Seymour Siegel takes note of educating for democracy and puts his spin on it. He says, radio with a purpose. And Siegel is pictured here with Mayor Lindsay up top, switching on WNYC's FM's new transmitter at the Empire State Building in 1966. And pictured here as well our continued event coverage with President Kennedy on a visit to Gracie Mansion in 1962, and civil rights leader Baird Rustin pictured there at a WNYC mic at a Harlem rally in 1965. Next slide, please. Nothing characterizes the 1970s more than the city fiscal crisis and the really devastating effect it had on the station. It led to the resignation of Director Seymour Siegel. The Beam administration marked the station's 50th anniversary in 74 with a cake and lots of thinking about how to get WNYC out of the city budget, including the possibility of funding it as a public benefit corporation or possibly as a nonprofit organization. There's even a trial membership drive in 1975 to gauge listener response that raises $30,000, and you can see them there at the telephones in what we used to call the rotunda, the 25th floor of the municipal building on this slide. It's a precursor of many more fundraisers to come, as well as more tote bags and mugs than you can shake a stick at. Of course, the 1970s also brings the first airings of NPR's All Things Considered and Morning Edition over WNYC. Mayor Koch brings in Mary Parrott Nichols, a muckraking journalist from the Village Voice, pictured here looking very no-nonsense, and she was. Nichols helped launch WNYC coverage during the newspaper strike in 78 in collaboration with NPR and the dailies to bring about an award-winning production known as the Sunday Papers. She also set about getting WNYC Foundation on track with a lot of help. It launches in 1979, and you can see the certificate of incorporation cover page there on the lower right. It's the first grant they win or get approved for is for a 1979 storytelling festival, which you see a little bit of our program guide cover there on the upper right. Next slide, please. The 80s is marked by recovery and growth from the austerity of the 70s. The decade begins with getting a satellite connection with NPR, so we become one of a handful of public radio ground stations. There's also a focus on 20th century American and new music, and the leading producers there are hosts Tim Page and John Shaver, who I'm sure you're well familiar with. The 1980s brings new state-of-the-art studios, replacing the old WPA studios and equipment. There's contemporary radio drama with the radio stage and innovative new kids programming with Small Things Considered, which wins a Peabody, the station's first since 1962. And new voices, like that fellow in the upper left of your screen. On the roster, Brian Lair, Steve Post, Leonard Lopate, Amy Goodman. There's also selected lots of things with Symphony Space on the Upper West Side with selected shorts and wall-to-wall concerts. And the newsroom launches highlights program called Urban News Weekly. Next slide, please. The 90s begins with an end to the longest running dispute in FCC history, or so I'm told. WNYC no longer has to sign off at sundown so as not to interfere with WCCO in Minneapolis at night. We switched to a new frequency at 8:20 a.m. and can stay on the air 24/7. Kids programming begins anew with New York Kids, and there's a series of live weekly cabaret performances. FM celebrates its 50th anniversary with a major concert event at Alice Tully Hall, including a host of commissioned musical works. Kurt Vonnegut becomes WNYC's reporter on the afterlife, a series of the many that you can hear on our website. There's live music of all kinds in the studio every weekday on Around New York from 1991 through 1996, and David Garland's eclectic brew of music hits full stride in the 1990s. David is pictured here catching an LP before it flies off the roof of the Municipal Building. There's also landmark programming coming out of WNYC TV aimed at the gay and lesbian community. The newsroom expands. Sarah Fishko begins her long-running series, Fishko Files. Again, another series of must-hear archive programs on our website. And finally, the 1990s brings long, hard negotiations with the Giuliani administration over the future of WNYC AM, FM, and television. Next slide, please. The issue of editorial independence at WNYC was always in question as long as the station was owned by City Hall. And NYC could never escape the perception of being controlled by whichever administration was in power, and no matter how hard they may have tried to distance themselves, whether it was the Highland, Walker, LaGuardia, Wagner, or their successors. And there was some real interference at times, as mentioned, with Highland in the beginning, and with LaGuardia, with Koch, and with Giuliani. In addition, the saving of taxpayer money was among the reasons many called for WNYC's abolition on a nearly annual basis from 1924 through 95, when the city finally negotiated the sale of the stations. In brief, it's truly a miracle that WNYC survived. And I would note I wrote a whole big piece about it. You can look for my web article at wnyc.org called The Station That Dodged Bullets. Unfortunately, the sale of WNYC included the commercial sale of Channel 31, a truly unique outlet in public television history. And as you can see here in the top photo, Mayor Giuliani is shaking hands with WNYC Foundation Chair Erwin Schneiderman, with board member Peter Darrow standing behind them. It's March 1995, and the deal to sell the radio licenses to the nonprofit foundation was then made. But WNYC's task at hand is then to raise the license money to get the station in the hands of the nonprofit foundation, with the help of listeners like Sarah Jessica Parker, pictured below at the kickoff of the Independence campaign. That photo was taken in May 1995, and you can see the Independence logo there. And later that year, Laura Walker is hired as the first non-mayoral appointee to run WNYC, and she's pictured in the lower right of your screen, with the Mayor Giuliani on January 27, 1997, with the payment of the first installment of the $20 million of license money. Next slide, please. The Walker era was a time of growth and change from a relatively small public radio station to a truly multi-platformed media company. The biggest ticket item was the move from the Municipal Building to Barrett Street after 84 years of broadcasting from the old Muni Building. The Jerome L. Green Performance Space, New Jersey Public Radio, WQXR, WNYC Studios, and the Gothamist fill out the current portfolio. There are a few major catastrophes along the way, with 9/11, a blackout, Superstorm Sandy. Still, the station's producers continue to churn out award-winning program. It's true, times are a bit tougher now economically, but WNYC continues to produce the kind of content in the public interest that began in 1924 and expanded under the leadership of people like Novick, Siegel, and Nichols, the kind of programs our listeners have come to expect after a century on the air. So I say to you, listeners, viewers, stay tuned. And again, I guess we can go to the next slide. To listen to the WNYC broadcasts from the New York City Municipal Archives and WNYC collections, you can go to wnyc.org, skip to the bottom of the page and click on Archived Shows. For features and articles on WNYC history, same thing. WNYC.org, skip to the bottom of the page, click on Audio Archives, and then go to the History link roll. And you can also sign up for the New York Public Radio History Notes newsletter, which comes out every week, as mentioned, on the newsletter page for WNYC, and get tweets from @WNYC Archives. Finally, I'd like to thank the Leon Levy Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Metropolitan New York Library Council for their ongoing support of our digitization efforts. Thanks again to the New York City Municipal Archives and to my great staff. And I will leave you with this thought from James Baldwin when he said, "History is not past, it is the present. We carry our history with us. We are our history." And with that, to Michael, thank you all.
Thank you, Andy. Before I start my presentation, I just want to say that one of the things I learned when working on this exhibit was that that the WNYC, or New York Public Radio Archive, only started in 2000 and I have known Andy, I think, since then, but I don't think I realized that he was actually starting the archive the year that I met him. And I can't believe how much work he has done in that time period, really single-handedly rescuing the history of WNYC. So the WNYC, let me just start my presentation here. Oops, share screen. New York Public Radio WNYC Archive is their repository of the station's history, but the New York City Municipal Archives has really the repository of the pre-sale history in terms of audio recordings from when they began recording them in the there's a couple existing from the 20s, but really in the 30s up through the 1970s before they started to become independent, and also of the WNYC TV and film archive. But when we thought about doing this exhibit in 100 years of WNYC for Photoville, we were faced with this real challenge of how we have so much material and how do we put this all into a 20-foot long shipping container, which is how Photoville presents exhibits as these pop-up exhibits. So luckily, Andy had created this timeline of important events in the station's history and important guests and programs over the years. And I was able to use that timeline to go through and pick and choose things that I thought we had to have in there. But we were still faced with this other problem, just what was the visual documentation, because it is, after all, Photoville. So in the early days in the Department of Plant and Structures, there was a lot of documentation because that was the agency that had started the radio station. And we had these wonderful glass plate negatives. And many of the early ones were done by Eugene de Salignac, who was the photographer for the New York City Department of Plant and Structures. His boss was Grover Whalen, and so he was there for a lot of the early moments, including this, which, as Andy has pointed out, this is not actually the first broadcast. This is probably them testing the signal strength before the first broadcast, because this is the radio room and not the broadcast room. But there's Grover Whalen there on the phone with some of the WNYC engineers on July 8th, 1924. So we have a lot of these behind the scenes images. We have photographs of some of the early musical guests or other announcers. This is the Flannelly brothers, I believe, is their name, or but they were early Irish musicians, very popular. And also the Department of Plant and Structures used WNYC not just as a radio station, but they were the municipal broadcasting system later on. But they would do public broadcasting. They would set up for sound for mayoral events. I think this is after a July 4th event, but they would do that up through the 1980s. Again, both of these by Eugene de Salignac. But we realized we also had to talk about what was going on in the city. It couldn't just be photographs of the radio station. So we included some other images, like this one of Eugene de Salignac's of a line for a food giveaway on Christmas Eve during the Great Depression. So as we started to look, we realized once we got out of those early days, there wasn't so much documentation of the radio station, but in the 1930s, we had photographs like this of the Radio Row in Lower Manhattan, which was Cortlandt Street, which was where all the radio vendors and repair shops set up. And it just highlights how important radio was becoming at that time, not just in the city, but nationwide. And we also had these wonderful WPA art images, this painting of the WNYC transmitter in Greenpoint, and this hand-painted it's a photograph of a hand-painted poster that was done by Frank Greco, who was a WPA artist. But I knew we needed to bring in more than just that, so I started looking at the ephemera that we had, including these very early issues of the Masterwork, what was originally called the Masterwork Hour, which was the program guide for WNYC. The one on the left there is the very first one they issued. I just loved how it looked like a hand-drawn zine. And then later on, it became the Masterwork Bulletin. And those two on the right there, one is for the 1939's World's Fair, and the other one is for the 1964 World's Fair. So I asked Photoville if it was acceptable for me to not just use photographs, but to use ephemera and audio and bring in all these other elements. And they said, sure, go for it. So luckily, later on, the program guides started to become more colorful and actually include images on them. We have Woody Guthrie. This one here, Rocking with the Box, is Ralph McDaniels on the cover there, who started in 1984, I believe, a show called Video Music Box, which was the first television program to show hip hop videos about 5 years before MTV's Yo MTV Raps came out. So very groundbreaking. I think he was about 24 years old at the time. And then on the right here, we have John F. Kennedy Jr. had also hosted a show around that time, Heart of the City. The WNYC TV and film division was started in 1949. Their first film was this film called City of Magic, which was just a half-hour-long promo film for the city. They later redid it in 1956 in Technicolor, and they're pretty great films of that era. And the film division, right from the start, was really not making films for theatrical release. They were making films for television broadcast. And in 1962, they actually started their own channel, Channel 31, and on there they would broadcast shows that were trying to get out word about public health issues, or during the Cold War about civil defense. These types of issues. And here you can see on the right, that's a camera crew in City Hall, and they were doing a lot of that type of material as well. Basically, sort of the C-SPAN of their day. Here's a couple of film stills that I was able to find from their films. Baby Knows Best was one of the films they had done, which was instructions for new mothers. And then there's an image there from one of their civil defense films and one of the original film cans. I knew in the 1960s that we'd have to have some images that showed some of the political upheavals of the time. We had a great image here of Martin Luther King receiving an award from Mayor Wagner right after he returned from winning the Nobel Prize in 1964. We also had some more uplifting images, the New York Mets ticker tape parade from 1964, and some images of the Vietnam War. We had a sort of wish list of images and audio that I was hoping to get for this. We weren't able to find everything, but Andy was great at digging through what he had, and I was digging through what we had, and we had some fun surprises along the ways, such as in the 1970s and 80s, there was not that much documentation because the city did not really have a photographer assigned to photographing WNYC. But Alfred Tropia, who was a radio engineer for WNYC, that's him on the lower right-hand corner, had taken a number of great color slides of the WNYC broadcast tower and the Greenpoint station and just some operations around the city. So we were able to tap into some of those as well. And then for the more recent time period, I knew we wanted to have something on 9/11. The World Trade Center was, of course, where the WNYC broadcast from. So they lost their FM transmitter that day, as well as being a huge event for the city. And then down below here, we have some images that we got. Both those images are from mayoral photographers, Sandy and WNYC in the 9/11 image. But WNYC had this nice image from one of their engineers of the AM transmitter in New Jersey that was damaged by Hurricane Sandy and knocked them off the air again. And then we have a photograph there of Brian Lair in his first broadcast from his home studio, again taken by a WNYC engineer. That's the March 2020 first broadcast because of COVID home broadcast. I took Andy's rather extensive timeline and I wanted to make it into a more truncated timeline for the exhibit so that we could see some of the highlights. And we had to pick and choose which timeline events we thought were most important. And then I tried to design this to look like a radio dial. So we have in here our tuner on this particular timeline, tuned to the Independence Day. And then the final panels, we decided on 4x8 foot panels, and each one would cover 25 years of WNYC's history. So this would be panel 1, 1924 to 1949. We're just able to get these early desalignment images in here, as well as some of the other ephemera. Panel 2 here is 1950 to 1974. We have Seymour Single there as at a tape deck as well. Panel 3, 1975 to 1999. And again, making much more use of those program guides and Alfred Tropia's photos. And then panel 4 here is 2000 to 2024, covering the more recent independent years of WNYC. And the final installation in our container looks like this. And Photoville is going to be up for another 2 weekends. It's up until June 16th. And we have, you can see the installation, and in the background we have a reproduction of yet another one of those early 1930s WPA. Were those WPA or not, Andy? The Lorimer paintings.
That's a little. It was probably under. It might have been on one of the civil construction agencies that he did them. I mean, Lorimer was an architect, and I haven't determined exactly how he came to paint those, but he was obviously involved with the Greenpoint transmitter site, and it's going up in 1937.
Yeah. So you can see there on that image, it highlights the Greenpoint transmitter site, and it's showing the planes flying out there also because they were using it as a beacon for air control, right?
Well, basically, the call letters effectively in the backyard of the building where the towers were. The call letters they lit them up at night with a directional north arrow, so that on clear nights, planes flying overhead could help them with the directional bearings.
Right. All right. So with the audio, again, 100 years of audio. Trying to fit that into something that somebody would sit down and listen to, but not being able to tell the story fully was a real challenge. And Andy was really great at pulling audio. I sometimes would have asked for specific pieces of audio. Other times I would just say, pick a topic and say, what do you have on this? So let's listen to a little bit of audio, and then I'll turn it over to leave time for questions and discussion.
Today, the City of New York takes its place in the field of radio broadcasting. Municipal Voice of Greater New York now presents your host and chairman, the Honorable Grover A. Whalen.
It gives me great pleasure to launch this, the Voice of New York, onto the airwaves. There to join the great and glowing fraternity of free American channels of communication. Radio broadcasting stands today as one of the most important educational media. Colonel Lindbergh. On the board, Dave.
Whoops. I didn't mean to do that, but that very first broadcast is not the actual broadcast. That is a 1948 recreation of the broadcast, but the following was the Lindbergh, and I just want to highlight some of the other important events here.
Today, the City of Philadelphia producer Denmark. Our next World's broadcast will be your Women's Time Reporter at 6:15. This is the Municipal Broadcasting System.
The battleship USS Oklahoma were reported attacked in Pearl Harbor. 2 were said to have been sunk, but this was not immediately confirmed officially. Several of the attacking Japanese planes were shot down as anti-aircraft batteries retaliated. The city station WNYC will remain on the air for an indefinite period tonight to bring New Yorkers news, emergency public service messages, and special announcements and orders from next week.
Ladies and gentlemen, we now have the great privilege of introducing Mrs. Franklin D. Roosevelt. You may find it difficult to believe, but the beloved former First Lady of the land is with us today in the role of a disc jockey for the March of Dimes.
Well, now, what do you want to be played for you?
Well, Ready Teddy.
Oh, and who do you want to have sing it?
Well, I like Elvis Presley.
Oh, you all like the same person, don't you? All right, but we don't put that on.
Red, go, man, go. I gotta get it on. So that's the right.
All right, I was told I was mumbling at the end there, so I will try to speak up more. But so again, I wanted to highlight WNYC was the first New York City station to announce the attack on Pearl Harbor. But then there's this great I wanted something on rock and roll for the 50s. And Andy said, how about Eleanor Roosevelt DJing Elvis Presley? And I mean, that's just fantastic piece of audio. And then later on, we had to bring in some of the TV audio as well, which
Our leader on the March to Freedom, a giant who must walk through the gates of freedom in the years he remains here on this earth. He must. I give you Nelson Mandela. Hey, good. You, the wonderful people of New York. And you, the people of New York. I and my delegation are overwhelmed.
Hi, I'm VJ Ralph McDaniels, and welcome to another edition of Video Music Box. Today, we're going to do something special. With the current dropout rate rising, violence in the streets increasing, and racial tension at an all-time high, we decided to go back to school, and we're going to do it live.
So that's a little clip of Video Music Box, but you can listen to the full 23-minute audio montage at the blog I did this past week, which is available at archives.nyc/blog. But I'll stop it there, and we can have a little discussion and questions.
Thank you, Michael. So my name is Melissa Minnick, and I'm with the Department of Records as well. And I worked with Michael and Andy to put together 100 years of WNYC. And I would just like to emphasize with everyone, just how much we really had to work with. It's 100 years worth of photos, film footage, audio recordings, masterwork hour programs from 1935, vintage WNYC microphones, a lot, anything and everything that you could imagine, carefully gathered, saved, preserved. So a big kudos to Andy, Michael, everyone who's really, really taken the time and care to preserve these things and allowing us to decide how to represent that. So I'm going to ask a few questions, and then we'll turn it over to everyone in the room here as well. So please think of your questions as well. Michael and Andy, for both of you, I'd like to start by asking, I would say there are good things about a radio station being owned and operated by city government, and also good things about it being independent. One thing I'm immediately thinking of is Mayor Koch's The John Hour. Say what you will about that. But what would you say have been the pros and cons of each? Andy, would maybe start with you.
Well, of course, it was under the Koch administration that we got our new studios. They broke ground for it in late 1981, and they opened up in December 1985. And it was a total overhaul, and it was like a total gut rehab of the 25th floor of the municipal building. That was something that city government was wonderful for. And as you mentioned, the John Hour, well, that was something he imposed. He and D.A. Morgenthau effectively imposed on Mary Nichols, and basically led to her resignation. She did come back to the station. She was actually a good friend of Ed Koch's, but it was an issue with basically the administration interfering, just as Mayor Giuliani did, pressuring the station to take on Curtis Lewa in the 1990s, where it didn't seem quite like a good fit for a lot of people at the station at the time.
Thank you. Michael, I don't know if you have anything to add.
No, I mean, I would just say that I'm sure it had its pros and cons, and as Andy has said, in the 70s when funding was very short, they really suffered from it. In the 80s, not just the TV station, but I mean, not just the radio station, but the TV station actually really bounced back with a lot of innovative programming. I mean, the quality level of the TV programming was not much above that of public access television, but they were doing a lot of groundbreaking shows. One of the first gay shows about gay and lesbian history, first hip hop show, things like that. They were really unafraid.
Okay.
If I could add, I would also say about the 70s. I mean, there's an example of where government funding was really needed and necessary because, I mean, as far as the history goes, the Municipal Archives WNYC radio collection pretty much comes to an end at 1970. Because a lot of material wasn't recorded, or they didn't have money for tape, or was being bulk erased and recorded over. And there are still some gaps to fill. I've been in touch with a lot of former producers. I've bought stuff on eBay. I've repatriated material from other institutional collections that did show people who did, or organizations that did shows here in the 70s, fortunately took their tapes with them. So it helped make up or fill the gap.
I want to ask you, what has been WNYC's impact on New York City and beyond, the people, culture, civic life?
Well, I think it's been an immense impact. And obviously, since we started streaming on the web, we have listeners all over the world now. There's no limit to the audience as long as you can log in or get on the web. So it's been an enormous impact. I think overall, it's hard for me to gauge at the moment with specifics, but I would say that we've been an important broadcaster for a long time.
Michael, I don't know if you have anything to add.
No, I not at all. I was just looking through some of the questions. I just saw that somebody had asked about where the original transmitter is. It's still, the transmitter building is still there in Greenpoint. In 2012, it became New York City Parks Transmitter Park. I'm not exactly sure what the building is being used for in the park, but
I think there's the Friends of Transmitter Park are working in collaboration with the New York City Parks Department to figure out how to get the building fixed up, repaired, and what its future uses will be. Of course, we were there from 1937 until 1990, and actually prior to that, we were transmitting from the municipal building on the 25th floor. The studios and the transmitter were in the same place. Of course, the signal at that time wasn't all that terrific. The antenna was actually on the building, on the municipal building. So moving it to Greenpoint improved our signal reach and coverage to a great extent.
So we have another question now about when did streaming begin?
It's on my timeline. I'm trying to remember. It's on the timeline somewhere, isn't it, Michael? I believe streaming started 98 or 9. I can't remember immediately off the top of my
I have
head.
to pull up the time. That sounds about right. Yeah.
Late 90s, yeah, because basically the program guides program guides came to an end with the website, and then of course once the website was up, then streaming came along.
Somebody was asking about the WPA murals, if they're still in the building. I believe most of them were moved to Varick Street. Is that correct?
Oh, no. I wish, in a way. No, the Art Commission for the City of New York basically had aegis or control over them. The Louis Schenker mural remains on site on the 25th floor, north end of the floor there at the Municipal Building. The Von Vicht is on the 3rd floor of the Brooklyn Public Library at Grand Army Plaza. The Byron Brown is at one of the courthouses, a new courthouse in Staten Island. And the Stuart Davis, of course, probably the most famous one, is at the Met and has been there since around 65, 66. We do have the sculpture that was dedicated in August 1939 when the murals were unveiled. The sculpture done by a artist named Max Baum is here in our reception area here at WNYC.
Somebody asked why the exhibit's only up for a short period of time. I'd just like to say that's Photoville is just it's a short pop-up exhibit. The panels are going to go to WNYC for their gala in the green space afterward, but I'm not sure beyond that what WNYC, if they're going to keep them up for a while or not. It's a discussion we'll have. I'd be happy for it to live on.
We also had a question about how much of the WNYC collection is digitized, and then what happens to the originals after digitization.
Andy can answer the question about how much the audio has been digitized.
Right. I'm very rough guess because we continue to acquire material, but I would say maybe we've still got stuff here to do, 75%. We're looking to be doing more through the American Archive of Public Broadcasting programs for digitization in the coming year. Yeah, obviously you guys can say more about what's happening on the film side.
Yeah, and to answer your question, with the historic materials that the WNYC archives and that the Municipal Archives has, we always keep the originals after digitization. All the original tapes that we have and films are stored in a cold storage vault in Brooklyn. Andy's got his own little cold storage vault. So we are doing our best to continue to preserve the originals. As far as the films go, we have digitized the most vulnerable films, the films that were deteriorating that we identified. We still have a long way to go in terms of digitizing the films. We did have a program in the 2000s of duplicating a lot of those films onto tape for preservation. So there's at least a backup of a lot of the films. But yes, there's a lot of work to be done still on the films, and we have done a fair amount of the tapes, but there's a lot more to do.
And I'm also seeing one about somebody who might have some memorabilia. and not sure who might be interested. I believe that would be an Andy question.
Yeah, I just wrote back, yes, exclamation point. So,
All right, great. So I want to say a huge thank you to Andy and Michael for presenting today and taking the time out. It was a great conversation, a lot of interesting history shared. I did post a couple links in the chats just for Michael's blog and then information on WNYC and Andy, as well as Doris. We definitely encourage you to check out the Photoville exhibit. It's going to be going on until the 16th. It is very, very cool. And there's also a lot of other cool artists there as well. So be sure to check it out. And thank you so much for attending. Have a great day.